Hi everyone, magandang araw po sa ating lahat. I am Aris Arugay, Professor and Chair of the UP Department of Political Science, and it is a pleasure to welcome everyone to this Philippine Social Science Seminar Series, or PhilS4 webinar entitled The Ethos of Obedience Among the Members of the Philippine Marines by Dr. Leslie V. Advincula Lopez. PhilS4 is sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and the City University of Hong Kong. Please visit the PhilS4 website in the CSEAC website for the previous PhilS4 webinars, and you can also check them on the Facebook page of PhilS4. Before that, some house rules. This webinar is being recorded live, but is also live on Facebook. In terms of questions and other comments, you may put them in the Q&A button, Q&A part of Zoom, as well as if you are watching us via Facebook, we will also monitor if you have questions posted via Facebook. With this, may I introduce the speaker of our webinar for today, Dr. Leslie V. Advincula Lopez, who is currently the Director of the Development Studies Program of Ateneo de Manila University, and she is also a Research Fellow of the Institute of Philippine Culture in Ateneo de Manila University. Dr. Leslie V. Advincula Lopez received her PhD in sociology from the University of the Philippines, where she specialized in the sociology of the military. But she also was able to acquire the prestigious U.S.-ASEAN Fulbright Scholarship, where she was affiliated with the University of Maryland Center for the Study of Military Organizations. Without much further ado, may I please welcome Dr. Advincula Lopez for her talk.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Aris Arugay. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So I'll try to make this presentation as casual as possible, and I will be sharing with you now my PowerPoint to study. And another thing is that when I look at local studies pertaining to the armed forces of the Philippines, the literature is really very scant. So I think, and even if there were some literature, it's just pertaining to the institution in a broad sense, but not actually including the perception, the narratives, okay, the narratives of the soldiers and the officers themselves. And given in the last 20 or 30 years that we have many occasions of military standoff or attempts coup d'etat that involves a number of Marine officers, I decided that this is what I would like to study, the ethos of obedience and how they actually navigate that, construct and deconstruct it. So how did I approach the topic? Okay, so when you look at the military, it's actually a paradox because they are supposed to protect the nation against foreign aggressors. They have weapons, they have guns, they have all these armaments, and they're supposed to be the most powerful, okay, bureaucracy under the Department of Defense. But at the same time, they do not call their shots all the time because it's actually the civilian authorities who determine how they proceed with their operations, with their strategies. And then, as we all know, the country experienced a lot of changes, okay, fluctuations, or what I call later on as perturbations, especially in the socio-political aspect. And as I pointed out, okay, referred to earlier, the Philippine Marines, okay, although it is strictly a part of the Philippine Navy, is known for having its own subculture. Like, the saying that tell it to the Marines, okay? So if you're able to make them believe, okay, then I will believe you also. That is also applicable to the members of the Philippine Marines because as per my field work and own observation, they don't actually believe the statement of any other individual only when it is spoken or given directly by their direct superiors. So definitely, in terms of language, in terms of values, in terms of rituals, there is definitely a subculture of the Philippine Marine. Okay? So how did I proceed in studying? As I pointed out, there is a palpable shift on how officers of the Philippine Marines across time were able to define, reconstruct, and redefine their notion of obedience to supposedly civilian authority. So I decided to take a long historical view by using historical institutionalism. And by that, I decided to focus on three cohorts of the Marines. The first one being the first company, which were actually the product of the first company when it was just put together in the 1950s, okay? Supposedly to fight the Hukbalahabs, the smugglers, and a little bit of restiveness in southern Philippines. Then, as we all know, the military actually gained a lot of power during the time of martial law, during the time of President Ferdinand Marcos. And then, although in the 1986 post-EDSA, which we're going to celebrate again over the weekend, there's supposed to be a lot of policy pronouncements, policies actually, even in our constitution saying that the military should be limited to certain facet of Philippine society. Did not actually happen, okay, the way it was planned. Okay, so I'm taking these special or important events as a form of perturbations that actually changed the organization of the Marines and inadvertently affected in the way Marine officers and Marine soldiers view themselves, okay, as part of the organization. In a way, it kind of empowered them, okay, or negated their propensity to negotiate the rules and regulations of the bigger civilian government. And then I am of the mind that even if it's a very supposedly hierarchical organization, the individual soldiers and officers, most importantly, have some resources within the organization to navigate and redefine what is supposedly a very cut and dry obedience to civilian authority. So the three junctures, if I may repeat, are: first is the establishment of the Philippine Marines in the 1950s. Second is the declaration of martial law that kind of put the military in a very powerful position within Philippine society. And thirdly, okay, ideally after the 1986 post-EDSA military, which clipped the powers of the AFP. We knew that it did not happen because during the time of President Corazon Aquino, there were, depending on how you're doing the counting, there are like 8 or 9 coup attempts. There was also the Bonifacio standoff more recently, and also the Oakwood mutiny. So what is happening here? Okay, so I took a long view. So there is the agency in the middle, the organization which is supposedly controlling everything in a supposedly hierarchical organization, which is the Marines. But things are changing. It's more fluid as they go through the perturbations and the changes that are happening in the broader, more external Philippine society. So if we're going to use this as a basis for understanding what happened in the 1950s, okay, and what brought about the emergence and the organization of the Philippine Marines. So in the 1950s, you will remember that then Secretary of National Defense used to be very close, okay, to a high-ranking officer of the Philippine Navy. What is actually interesting is that Secretary Magsaysay then, who's from Zambales, was able to actually observe the workings of the U.S. Marines because he was a frequent visitor in the then Subic military installation of the U.S. forces. That time, Lieutenant Commander Ramon Alcaraz, who used to be the head of Philippine contingents within the base, was saying, given the problems with the hook balahab and given the problems we have with smuggling, we need to have amphibious, quick reaction, expeditionary forces that is similar, very similar to what we are observing with the U.S. Marines. So true enough, okay, with the power vested on Ramon Magsaysay, then secretary, he sent Ramon Alcaraz to the U.S. to actually observe the workings of the U.S. Marines. And when Ramon Alcaraz, who became a high-ranked officer in the Philippine Navy, came back, then they decided that, hey, it is really time to put together our own version of the Marines. Okay? And then another accident is that there is actually a young PMA graduate, Commodore Gregorio Lim, who used to be a member also of the Philippine Navy. Again, he was sent to the US, to undergo infantry training at Fort Benning. So many of their trainings, their doctrines, their rituals, and all that were actually patterned from the US Marines. Initially at the get-go, some officers of the Philippine Marines asserted that we want to have our own version of the Marines. But then Secretary Magsaysay and Commander Alcaraz put their foot down. No, you're going to copy in toto what you've learned from the U.S. Marine. Actually, the first company of the Philippine Marines were sent to then Sangley Point to undergo training from the U.S. Marines. And you can see here that because of the codified rules and resources within the organization of the Philippine Marines, it's not yet as defined that time, all these personalities were actually able to carve their own niche in organizing the Marines. For example, it is kind of odd that the anniversary and the rituals of the Marines was unilaterally determined by then Commandant of the Philippine Marines, Commodore Lim. So when they were thinking of what should be the date of the anniversary and all that, they decided that no, it will be too obvious if I use November 17, which is my birthday. So let's just remove the first digit and put it down as November 7. So up to today, mind you, the anniversary or the birthday, as they call it, because the U.S. Marine called their anniversary also as birthday, is still November 7. So during that time, the product of all this, including General Biason, although there were some spaces, especially for the high-ranking officer, when they defined professionalism, which is part and parcel of their obedience to civilian authority, it is always what is the mission of the organization. And there is no space to question that. However, much later on, okay, when changes happen in the bigger socio-political dynamics, which is external to the Marine organization, that changed. And later on, I will be discussing the cases of Ariel Corobin, okay, who was also a Medal of Valor, the highest military honor, but was also a prominent figure in a number of coup attempts. Okay, as he was a member of Revolutionaryong the RAM, or also the ones who staged a number of coup d'etat during the time of Corazon Aquino, and also Gary Alejano. So let me proceed with that. Gary Alejano used to be the member, okay, of the House of Representatives, but for most of us, Gary Alejano was also a Marine officer who figured prominently in the Oakwood Mutiny during the time of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. Okay. So how did they define? Okay, so the civilian control, as far as Biason is concerned, is clear-cut. Okay, hands down. Okay, they determine what is our operation, what is our objective, and I will just follow. It doesn't matter if I do not agree, if I see corruption within or outside, but I follow my commander-in-chief. Okay. However, as we all know, together with the martial law is also the advent of a number of insurgency groups in the country. Ideally speaking, the armed forces of the Philippines should busy itself with external defense. But that doesn't happen in the case of armed forces of the Philippines, because the armed forces of the Philippines since the 1960s and up to today are very much preoccupied with internal insurgency operation, what we call internal security operations. And maybe that's also the reason why we're not able to develop our external defense power, is that because they were too busy. And that has implication in the way the military perceive, specifically the Marines perceive themselves. Because as pointed out by authors and theoreticians in Latin America, and to a certain degree, this is what I also observed in the Philippines when I went around in Mindanao, talked with Philippine Marine officers assigned in Jolo and Basilan, is that they feel that the national government, okay, has actually failed the people miserably. There were instances, for example, that the only representative of the national government in the area are the Philippine Marines. And therefore, they were forced to do all kinds of things, non-traditional things that normally, a soldier or an officer would do. Some of them ended up doing a lot of civil military operations, health drives, vaccination drives, livelihood projects, and even becoming teachers in areas that are controlled by, MILF or Abu Sayyaf, because no teachers are actually um, willing to teach the children there. So what is the result? The likes of Ariel Carabin and Gary Alejano were arguing that since we understood the problem much better than the legislators or even the bureaucrats in Manila, then we have every right to step in if in case we feel, okay, that the government is failing us. So what I'm basically saying is that even if the hierarchy within the Marine as an organization is clear-cut, they're actually, even among the enlisted personnel, they refer to them as the number of class, which to me is an indication of a very hierarchical organization. When they negotiate or when they deal, okay, with the pronouncement of civil government, okay, that you stand down, okay, this is where you are supposed to be, that is subject to a lot of negotiation and fluidity. Okay. Another thing that I noticed, which was not evident during the time of the first Marine Company, like Senator Biason, is that their being PMA graduate was never invoked as a special resource or a special location, which is quite obvious among the younger cohorts of the Philippine Marines, starting with those who graduated during the time of martial law and even after the 1986 EDSA revolution. They kept reminding me that we are, the bright and the brightest, the most qualified, because we are graduates of PMA. And they use a lot of this as a social capital, not only in negotiating with the higher ups within the AFP, but also in finding or locating themselves in terms of the best assignment within the Philippine Marines. If, for example, we get the numbers of Philippine Marines who were actively involved in a series of coup d'etat in the 1980s up to the 2000, a huge percentage of these officers are actually graduates of PMA. So that kind of perception that we're cut above the rest was not palpable in the first Marine Company of the 1950s and even in the 1960s. So what I'm basically saying is that there's an overlay of, being involved in the insurgency operation and at the same time seeing themselves at a cut above the rest. And therefore, we know better, we understand the situation better, and therefore, if the civilian politicians, if the bureaucrats in Manila is failing us, or even within the AFP itself is failing us miserably, then we have every right to step in and test the boundaries of civilian authority. We cannot be subordinate because ultimately, at the end of the day, we owe our allegiance to the Filipino people. And I find it dangerous because sometimes their perception on what it is that is wanted or desired by the mainstream Philippine society may be a bit biased, okay, to a certain degree. And what I find really disturbing is that they are very astute, okay, politicized agents, and they can actually think of so many social, economic, and political justifications. Why are they having the standoff? What I'm showing you actually is the picture of Colonel Argel Curabin during the 2006 Bonifacio standoff. If you review actually the videos and the transcript of that event, he was invoking that we don't owe our allegiance to the government. Our allegiance, first and foremost, is to the Filipino people. So basically, okay, that kind of politicized and empowered agent, to my mind, and based on my empirical data, is a confluence of external and as well internal factor. External because we all know that President Marcos, okay, the older President Marcos, was actually able to implement martial law because he was propped up by the leadership of the military. And in exchange, okay, he actually provided a lot of incentive to the AFP. Up to the time when I was doing my field work, some of the members of the Philippine Marines are lamenting that, it's still better during the time of President Marcos because we don't have to, subscribe to human rights. We can just do whatever we want. We are privileged. We are special. And that is not the case anymore. And we're able, okay, to do our military operations without much hassle. Okay? Okay. So in conclusion, okay, so I cannot control my power. In conclusion, I would like to point out that for sure, there is a definite palpable change within the way the officers and men of Philippine Marines define, practice, and live their ethos of obedience. What is very telling is that when you ask them in a theoretical sense, okay, what is their understanding? They have, very clear understanding. They can actually quote verbatim the Philippine Constitution. But when you probe further, if there are situations, for example, that would require them to decide otherwise, the younger cohort, when I say the younger cohort, meaning those who were commissioned during martial law and post 1986 EDSA revolution, were quick to point out that it is not to this leadership or to this government. If we feel that the interests of the Filipino people are being threatened, then we have every right, okay, to step in. And if you have that kind of blanket, okay, reasoning, that can be dangerous, especially so based on the literature also and based on what these research participants are telling me, coupled with, questionable legitimacy of the government. For example, if you review the reason for the 2006 Fort Bonifacio standoff, one of the thing that came out is that a lot of Marine officers were actually questioning the legitimacy of Macapagal Arroyo as the truly elected leader because they felt bad that the Marines was used to cheat in some parts, okay, or to tamper with the election results in some parts of Mindanao. For sure, martial law is a turning point. And what is very interesting is the comment made by one officer. We tend to think that, we have to always push back, okay, the Marines to their barracks. But the thing is, they are already out of the barracks, and we just have to deal with that. Okay, martial law allowed them to be out there. Okay, to be negotiating and to be reasoning, okay, or cooperating, or even uh, fighting against a civilian government. So we have to find that sweet spot so that even if there are occasions for restiveness, it can be quelled right away. Okay? The Marines are not just warriors who are expert in terms of war fighting. The Marine, both the officers and the men, are very astute politicians. They know what is happening there. So in combination to factors like legitimacy, economic factors, for example, poor living conditions of the Marine soldiers, if you combine these elements together, there's no telling if there's another coup or another attempt to test the boundary will happen in the future. So in a nutshell, okay, by viewing a longer or using a longer time frame, we're able to see very clearly how external factors in combination with the resources that are available to individual uh, Marine officers and soldiers located in a supposedly very hierarchical organization was able to navigate their way, redefine, and renegotiate what their understanding of what is uh, ethos of obedience. It is not a theoretical, cut and dry definition. It is a definition that is very dynamic, very active. And when the tide is going to turn, there is no telling because it's always in combination with the external factors, the fluctuations, or what I call the perturbations that is happening external to the organization of the Marines and even to the armed forces of the Philippines as a whole. Okay, so I think uh, that's it for today. And if you have questions, maybe we can start the discussion rolling. Thank you very much and good morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leslie, for giving us the talk about the Philippine Marines from a historical and institutional perspective. As someone who has been studying the military as well, I've had a lot of takeaways from this talk, and you are correct. There are very few studies on military subculture so far in the armed forces of the Philippines, and your own study through your doctoral dissertation fills a lot of gaps in our understanding of civil military relations, uh, because you focus and zeroed in on a very peculiar, very interesting subunit of what people normally think is a monolithic institution. Uh, so okay, we have some questions coming in, but let me use my moderator privilege to ask the first question. I was actually at the National Defense College of the Philippines yesterday, giving a talk on giving a lecture on civil military relations, insights from Latin America. Okay, because I did my dissertation also on coups and protests, focusing on some Latin American cases. And the sentiments of the students there, who are mostly from the AFP, is you have a military at present who seems to be conflicted in terms of their mission and their role, while a lot of them, or several of them, particularly among I perceive this among the Navy, is already oriented towards more external defense, the traditional role and mission of the military, of which the Philippine Navy, of which the Philippine Marines is supposed to be a part of. There are still a lot who believe that it is the military's mission to focus more on the internal security threats of the country, communist insurgency. And we know that through martial law, this role expansion is there. But according to you, this has already been inherent from the beginning. The military has always been internal oriented. And the literature has a lot of explanations on this, from the post-colonial nature of the military as a colonial army, to the presence of the US bases that provided the defense shield in the Philippines so that the military will not have to worry about external defense. But their first, as you are correct, their first missions were really the hooks, the smugglers, and supposedly other internal sources of insecurity. So at present, and according to your research, how does the Marines see themselves in this? I won't call it a debate, because the military is not supposed to debate, right? They're not a deliberate institution, although
They're
uh,
not, but they do.
but they do, right? And the
Yeah.
research of Professor Nicole Corato proves this, that there is some deliberation going on, even if ideally the military is a non-deliberative institution. But where do they, in your scan or in your interviews with former and maybe present military or members of the Philippine Marines, what are the, how do they view this internal external assignment of roles, and uh, what differentiates a Marine, a member of the Marines that's more focused towards internal, and a member of the Marines who is more focused on external? What could be the influencing factors in the way they view supposedly the mission of the Marines in particular, and the mission of the military, Philippine military in general?
Yes, that's a very good question, and I will answer it in two ways. Okay, because if you look at our armed forces of the Philippines, it's actually primarily, or a huge part of that is comprised by the ground forces, which is the Philippine Army. So for the longest time, they call the shots, they dominate. So there is actually a turfing issue here. So for the longest time, the Marines and even the Navy were complaining, we are an archipelago. How come that in terms of war material, in terms of armaments, in terms of equipment, why we're not getting enough ship? Why are we not getting enough amphibious equipment? Because the leadership of the AFP is dominated by the army, so they focus on the ground forces. So there's another issue there. So even if much as they recognize that the focus should now be on external defense, they are constrained because they feel ill-equipped, they feel ill-prepared to be dealing with external enemy. And with regard to the focus on external defense, that came out actually repeatedly during my interviews. The Marine generals and the Marine officers are very clear, definitive, that this internal insurgency should not be our main task. You know, we're supposed to do external defense. But because the police, they always mention the police are inept, and and we're not comparable with the police, and the army is not doing its job well, then if nothing else fails, diba, you call in the Marines. But they are very, very quick to point out that it's not based on the documents and the doctrines of the AFP that has been rehashed and revised. It is actually external defense. But because nobody is doing that, okay, then the Marines are doing that. And the downside of which is that, as I pointed out later on, because when you're doing counterinsurgency, you have to be dealing with the local government units. You have to be embroiled also with the local power dynamics. And that by itself is actually contributing to the politicization of the military in specific areas. And the dynamics actually vary. For example, you're in Mindanao, and because of the subculture, there is also a little bit different. Or if you're in Manila, or if you're in some parts of the Visayas. So there's no actually a cut and dried recipe. But for sure, the counterinsurgency operations, or the COIN as they call it, actually push the Marines to be embroiled and to be active and to actually negotiate and be close or chummy, okay, to the local government units, because as I said, they're very politicized, and they know that if they're not in good terms with the local officials, the governor and the mayor in particular, it would be a difficult, or their task, okay, would be doubly difficult. So there are two things there to repeat. There is actually the dynamic between the ground forces and the Navy within the GHQ, within the headquarters of the armed forces, and then also point as a push actually for a more politicized Marines that we're having.
Okay. Thank you for that. In fact, I've heard that there are also proposals for the Marines to be separated and to be a co-equal major service, right? So instead of just having the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, a fourth major service is being proposed. I'm sure this is being proposed by the Marines themselves, but what you're saying proves your reinforces your point that the elite perception, the perception that they're a cut above the rest, no, is not only a perception of the military in general, the way that they compare themselves to other security institutions like the police, who they who has been who has been perceived as the perpetual poor cousins of the military in the country. Uh, and I feel this even on the side of the police, because I also teach at the Philippine Public Safety College. So I in fact invest more of my time now in the training of the police, because I felt like the military has been, more exposed, and are they get a lot of help already, but the police remains to be a security institution that uh, that that needs a lot of reforms, needs a lot of help. Uh, we have a question from Dr. Kenneth Cardenas. He typed, Dr. Lopez, how does civil military and intramilitary command play out at the local scale in those parts where the country do extensive civil military operations, or CMOs? Specifically interested in, for instance, how Marines deployed on the ground navigate the military structure when they need to request resources above their pay grade in a disaster response situation.
Yeah, that is where the politicized military officer come into play. Like, for example, in my field work in Basilan, the general, who's the brigade commander at that time, pointed out how they negotiate or navigate the limited resources that are available to them. Specifically, he pointed out, I know it's a form of corruption that, I barter all the papers that we're getting from the higher headquarters. But we don't need papers, bond paper. I'm referring to typing paper. Here in Basilan, what we need are actually barbed wires, okay, to protect ourselves from the enemies. So, they do that. So it's not actually just with the local politician, but also with the local entrepreneur. Okay. I don't know how to translate this in English. The Chinese merchant that they refer to as kabise. Okay, kabise, the Chinese, usually these are Chinese merchants who control the economy and the commerce in many far-flung localities. So they have to be on good terms with them, because the extra resources that they needing, okay, for their military operations, they do barter it. And they have, with no apologies, they feel without qualms, they do it because first and foremost, it is the successful accomplishment of their military objective and what would be good, okay, for the Marines themselves. I mean, the soldiers, the people themselves. So I don't think I highlighted this enough. Closer than brothers is a very appropriate term for the Marines, because they really look out for each other, especially in areas when they do military operations, because nobody will. So, this is also a form of negotiation where even if the directive from the higher headquarters is quite clear, they feel that if it's going to put at stake the safety of the men, they will not follow it blindly, which is not the case, mind you, in the First Marine Company, because that time they consider themselves professionals. Okay, for example, Senator Biason. So even if, okay, there are the chances of succeeding is not as clear, I know my objective and this is what I will be doing. And going back to Basilan to answer more extensively the questions of Kenneth is that, you always have, okay, to be in good terms with the local governors, with the local mayors, because not only for the actual military operations and but also in terms of intelligence gathering. So that is why it is played out. Okay. However, the character and the nature of this relationship is something that is constructed and reconstructed depending also on the personalities of the local leaders. For example, in some areas in Mindanao, they feel, a form of affirmation if they can invite the Marines all the time in their parties, in their socials, all the time. And in turn, the Marines get some of the extra resources, okay, gasoline, food, okay, from the local government, which is always in short supply, okay, coming from the headquarters. But in some areas, for example, in Luzon, it is more clear-cut, the division. They are not as close. I still have to test the hypothesis that maybe because they feel that they are more threatened in some parts of the area, and therefore, to protect themselves, they have to also use, a number of protection by being chummy or very, very close with the local government units. I hope I
Thank,
answered your question.
thank you very much. In fact, the conduct of civil military operations by the military, particularly in conflict zones, in areas of the country where there's presence of communist insurgents, as well as in Mindanao, has been a locus of research as well. Where for us studying the military, Professor Rosalie Hall has done extensive studies on this, and how local civil military relations are vary according to to a host of factors, including local political dynamics, but also how they interact with at the national level. So far, this talk has not only it's not just has not only covered intra-military dynamics, but there are also dynamics that is quite different from at the national level, meaning military adventures like coup d'etats or mutinies, and at the local level where there are more technical civil military operations at play. So in fact, what this shows is the complicated intersectionality of studying the Philippine military by looking into subcultures, the sub-institutions within the military, but also at different levels, at the national level and even at the local level, to a point wherein if we go to the individual, so Dr. Leslie focuses on some such personalities as Ariel Cherubin and Gary Alejano. As a sociologist, this is something that for us in political science we rarely touch on. How does peculiar military experience, meaning where they were assigned, how did this figure in their perceptions on politics? So for example, the likes of Cherubin and Alejano, those who staged the Oakwood Mutiny, is there some experience maybe in combat or even in their relationship with the AFP top brass, as well as even with civilian politicians? Do particular lived experiences, being a military officer, do they influence the predisposition to be more political and to be more quite vocal about democratic politics in the Philippines? Or
Yeah.
if they're all Marines, they all think this way?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, to answer your question, I think, as I've mentioned before, it's a confluence of factors. Yeah, one is the idea that they are a cut above the rest. That is very palpable after the martial law, because they feel that they are a privileged segment of the society, and just don't tamper or toy with us. We are the ones doing the counterinsurgency. We are the ones who are actually being killed and killing people on the field. So therefore, if only for that, we have more right, okay, to step in if we feel that the national or even the institutional leadership are not doing its job well. What I noticed actually to add to the discussion is that the sheer anti-communist stance is just so very strong in some Marine officer because probably of the counterinsurgency operations that they experienced through the years. And for them, it is justified because their, comrade in arms, they see themselves being fell or being killed, okay, in action by these communist insurgents, and therefore, or even the Muslim insurgents in Mindanao. And therefore, during the time of Ramos, it is very telling when, where they're incorporating combatants from the MILF, or the MNLF, I'm sorry, they were only able to do that, okay, with the Philippine Army, but not with the Philippine Marines, because the Philippine Marines actually put its foot down that no, we're not going to accommodate it. And for me, okay, that is a very telling decision because, it is the president of the country is telling you that you have to accommodate in the spirit of long-term peace in the land. But the Marines are saying, no, they are the ones who killed our comrades in arms, so there's no way they're going to be accepted in our installations or going to be working side by side with us. It's just not acceptable. And that kind of negotiation is something that is unheard of, okay, during the 1950s and the 1960s, even though, okay, that time, the Biason et al. Were actually fighting also a different kind of insurgents, which are the hooks, okay? Although the hooks are mostly, I'm sorry, concentrated in Luzon.
Okay. For there's a question here that you might be very interested, and I would be very interested to hear how you will respond to this. Would you classify the military and the Marines as gentle or political warriors? Because you mentioned them being warriors, right? But this is an interesting question. Are they gentle or are they political warriors?
I will go back to my research framework that the agency is a dynamic one. It depends on who they're dealing with. If you are perceived, okay, as enemy, their enemy, as a company or as an organization, then they can be very ruthless. I've heard stories that I don't want to be repeating here. You know, uh, Terms like in Filipino, you take care of them, the enemies. And, that is a blanket authority for summary execution. So they can be very ruthless. But when they're dealing with, for example, with their families or people of authority or people who can make or break, okay, their career as a military officer or career officer, they can be very gentle. So my point is that they can be very astute and negotiator. They know which side of the bread is buttered, okay, or which side, okay, will help me in my career. Although not all Marine officers are this in terms of calculating in the way they do, but there's always that kind of algorithm in their head when they negotiate. It depends on which particular category you fall into. If you're considered like an insurgent or someone who actually ambushed a comrade in our say goodbye, cruel world, because they definitely will not be gentle with you. But if you're considered, as a civilian partner or an LGU partner, they can also be very charming and be very gentle on how they present themselves. But I think overall, that warrior mentality, it's still the dominant one. Although they are able to kind of package themselves that they can be gentle if the situation calls for it.
Okay. Finally, I want to ask, right? Because given that there's still a lot of gaps in democratizing civil-military relations, in reforming the military, in improving its professionalism, and the term that has been used by previous governments is no longer just military reform, but even security sector reform. Uh,
SSR.
what could be for you, what could be the priority reforms that are still needed to put in place in order to balance the professionalism and the effectiveness of the military in performing its functions, but at the same time making sure that they're not only effective, they're also accountable and
Yes.
democratically controlled. So what for you, and I would be interested to hear this, what for you are major policies that needed to put in place or policies that need to be changed in order for you to have a professional but democratically accountable Marines or even military?
Yeah. Maybe because I'm also an educator, you have to start, okay, at the very beginning. So if, for example, you're getting the cadre of your officers from the PMA, or the line forces like the General Staff Force and the National Defense College of the Philippines, liberal democratic values, you should start that early on. Because what I find sometimes disturbing is that when I talk with the junior officers or fresh graduates from the PMA, they don't have that you know uh, continuum of the political continuum. It's just either black or white. Your enemy or not enemy, you're insurgent or not insurgent.
Right.
If not with us, you're against us. But the liberal attitude that there are many shades of pink, okay, that's just not. Maybe it has something to do with the curriculum that maybe need to be revisited. Okay, that's one. Accountability also needs to start from the top. Okay, so you cannot ask your soldiers or officers to be accountable if your civilian government is not uh, being accountable. They're not walking the talk, so to speak. So everybody has to be accountable. And then you can still reinforce the existing policies, that you have to be really sanctioned if you're erring or going beyond the boundaries of democratic principles. Because it's not actually not everything is lost, I would say. For example, the older Marines, when you talk to them, their military objectives is primary. Okay? They have no notion of human rights. Okay? But the younger ones, they are, as I said, okay, they are more astute. Okay? They are aware that human rights and human security is there. Okay? They know that to be able to win this war, it's not just a military solution, but you have to also equip them. Okay? Meaning you have to give them, livable wages, which I think is also okay, and livable conditions when they are already in the area. So meaning you support their education, especially the officers, to be more liberal in the way they think. It's not just a matter of black and white. Okay? So that liberal attitude, as compared to other militaries around the world, I just do not see it yet, okay, with the younger cohort, but also support the organization, make it easier for them to do their objectives without crossing the boundaries. And as I said, continuous education, okay? Because in my dissertation, I also pointed out that as you go up the ranks, your worldview also changes. So therefore, the professional career courses should be an occasion, to pull them back. What is your objective? What is your main objective as an officer of the land?
Okay. With that, we would like to thank Dr. Leslie Advincola Lopez for giving us and sharing with us her research on the ethos of obedience among the Philippine Marines. We thank everyone who logged in Zoom at this early in Manila time, but we hope that this webinar could be of use to teaching and research. This will be uploaded in the PhilS4 YouTube website, but also on the Facebook page of PhilS4. So please stay tuned and watch for our announcements, because we will have another PhilS4 webinar in late March next month. And you will hear the next speaker and the next talk in the coming weeks. So maraming salamat, Leslie, and have a good day to everyone, and see you in the next PhilS4 webinar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
bye.